Hello and welcome to the IPA, the spiritual home of advertising. And welcome home to Rory, and what would be a more fitting setting than the very place where Rory led his behavioural economics presidential agenda than right here at the IPA. But tonight we have an even more prestigious guest. For that, we'd really like to thank Alexis and Penguin Publishing for making this wondrous occasion become a reality. We are extremely honoured to have with us tonight Professor Daniel Kahneman, a man that has inspired a generation of economists and psychologists, and he is without doubt the world's leading behavioural economist. The winner of the 2002 Nobel Prize for Economics and the author of the current New York Times bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. So, we think it's relevant because in today's harsh economic times, especially in the UK, we believe that thinking fast and slow has never been more relevant. There's never been a greater need to deepen our human understanding and never been a greater need to create new models in this era of austerity. And there's never been a greater need to change behaviour for the better. Over change, we fundamentally believe that now is the time to take these years of learning from Professor Kahneman and apply them in today's world. We need to embrace this new thinking and ensure it's implicit in everything that we do, across advertising, marketing, and all forms of creativity. By having a better understanding of people, we can create products and services that people want and find easy to use, but more than that, help people act in their own interests, others' interests, and society's interests. We may be optimistic and idealistic, but we hope we can make the world a better place. Quite simply, we need to create little ideas from big thinkers, and what bigger thinkers to tackle these issues than Daniel and Rory. And to pose the questions that we all want to ask, we're also honoured to have our host, Dr. Nick Southgate. Nick is the IPA's very own behavioural consultant. He is on our Big Thinking panel, and he also currently teaches at the School of Life. So on to the format of the evening. For the first hour, Nick will facilitate a conversation with Professor Kahneman and Rory, followed by prepared questions from the floor, after which we'll retire for drinks for those people that like to catch up with some old friends. And just to restate, we are webcasting for the first 60 minutes with approval from Rory and Nick and Professor Kahneman, at which point we'll stop at the 60 minutes because we don't have all of your guys' approval, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. So finally, feel free to tweet if there's anybody who'd like to tweet, and please feel free to tag with hashtag #OVChange. And as I say that, without further ado, I'd just like to open the proceedings, and it's over to Dr. Nick Southgate.
So thank you, Jez, for your introduction. Thank you all of you for coming. Thank you especially Professor Kahneman for making this possible. I knew that once you were coming, Rory would come. It would have been hard to keep him away. It's, obviously, tonight, we have 1,000 questions you might want to ask, so I have to start somewhere. But I think the first thing I think would be useful to talk about is the two heroes of your book. So they are System 1, thinking the fast thinking of the title, System 2, thinking the slow thinking of the title. And I thought it would be useful if you could just, as those I suppose are the abiding sort of metaphor, or the metaphors you use to your career, to gloss those. But also I think it's interesting, you're very clear in the introduction, that although they are the heroes in your book, they are fictitious heroes. And I thought it would be useful if you could explain a little bit about that as well. So start there.
Well, there are really two kinds of thinking. That's immediately obvious. So if I say 2 + 2, a number comes to your mind, and you didn't ask for it. You know, it just came. Capital of France, a word comes to your mind. If I say, you know, a nasty word like crime or vomit, you have an emotion. You didn't ask for it, nothing deliberate, it just happens. Then there is, and that's fast thinking. That's what I call fast thinking. And its hallmark is that it's automatic. I mean, it isn't experienced as voluntary. It's experienced as something that happens to you. Then there is slow thinking. And slow thinking is really, there's more variety in what slow thinking is. But certainly when you try to reason through a problem or a multiplication problem, in the example, I always use the same two numbers, 17 times 24. And, you know, when nothing comes to mind, that's not true, but what comes to mind is that you know it's a multiplication problem. You might know whether or not you can do it in your head. That could come very quickly, but you know, unless you've really misspent your youth, no number comes to your mind. So that's one kind of slow thinking. And the hallmark of that kind of thinking is that it's effortful. And it's effortful in multiple senses. There is actual mental work, and we feel that. There's physical work, because your body is involved in it. And there are signs of arousal, and the pupil dilates, and all sorts of changes of that nature. It's also effortful, and that's important, in that there is what psychologists call limited capacity for effort. The amount of effort that you can exert at any one time is limited. So you cannot compute 17 times 24, even if you can do it in your head. You can't do it, while making, in the UK, it would be a right turn into traffic. In the US, a dangerous one is a left turn into traffic. You can't do this because making a turn into traffic demands concentration. And when you concentrate on one thing, you can't concentrate on the other. Now, there is a completely different family of mental operations, if you will, that also demand effort. And they are controlling yourself. It's, something, in the jargon of psychologists, it's executive control. And it's everything that has to do with not saying what comes to your mind immediately, in checking yourself, in not doing what comes to your, what you feel like, not always doing what you feel like doing. And we know that that is effortful because you can interfere with it. So if, it's not a very large result, but it's a good illustration. When you tell people to keep 7 digits in their mind, and then you give them a choice of desserts, and one dessert is a luscious chocolate cake, and the other is a more virtuous fruit salad, they're more likely to pick the chocolate cake when their mind is full of numbers than in their normal state. And it's because self-control demands some of that mental energy or mental effort, which is in limited capacity. So that's what I call that system 2. And I really like to call them system 1 and system 2 because I think actually when you read the book, you'll have to tell me, but I know what I was trying to do. You're meant to develop a view of these 2 characters as if they were characters. They have personality. They do things. System 1 does these things. System 2 does these things. I call system 2 lazy because, we don't like exerting effort, or anyway, we don't exert much effort. Those are metaphors, and that's what you were saying. I'm not really making a claim that there are systems in the brain. They're not even systems. I mean, the word is wrong because systems are made up of interacting parts, and I'm not claiming that. Well, I didn't invent the words. I took them from somebody else who, by the way, has repudiated the terminology in the meantime. But he quite correctly called them type 1 and type 2 processes. I think it works better when you call them system 1 and system 2 because we're very, very good at forming personalities, images of personalities. So these characters, system 1 and system 2, you form ideas, you have a sense, like somebody that you know what they will do next. That's because they have those personalities. Those are entirely metaphors, and psychologists, and you're representing that, I think. You're not supposed to do it. There is a rule in psychology against explaining behavior by invoking little people in your head. They're called homunculi, and it's really a sin. And it's only because I'm very, very old that I can really afford to commit that sin. But some people still really disapprove of that language.
Because I think that's one of the things that makes it actually useful to people in marketing, though, and people in this community, is that we don't need a perfect understanding of psychology. We need a way of thinking about the way people think, and it gives us a very intelligent way to do that, a very perceptive way to do it. And I think we start to perceive them as personalities, and we can work with them. I suppose the next thing I want to just pick up on, and I'll start to draw Rory into this, is that you talk in the book with, shall I say, mixed optimism about our ability to train system 1 thinking or to learn over time to make better decisions. So I suppose the question is, can we learn to make better decisions?
Well, I'm surprised by the label mixed optimism. I didn't think there was any optimism. It's not. No, I'm really not. This is definitely not a self-help book. I really had two ideas about possible usefulness. One, which is really a grand hope, is to educate gossip, because I think people are fairly good at seeing the mistakes that other people make, much, much better than at seeing the mistakes while they're making them. So I think it is not self-help, it is really educating gossip. Now, educating gossip, I think, is a very good thing, because one thing that people do when they make decisions is they anticipate gossip. And I think that if people anticipated intelligent gossip, they would make better decisions than if they anticipate unintelligent gossip. So that's one hope. And the other one is that organizations, I think, can do better than individuals. Organizations think slowly, and they can arrange procedures to think better, much more than individuals can.
So I was going to say, it's one of the things, obviously, we're key. Our hope, our belief is that businesses and brand owners might be better at creating those kind of frameworks where people can make better decisions, make those right kind of decisions. So I suppose to bring Rory in on this. So so your favourite examples where people have designed a better decision? It'd be interesting to get some discussion between the two of you about your optimism and against the professor's self-confessed, less mixed optimism, I now realise.
Yeah. I suppose one interesting facet of calling them System 1 and System 2 is that obviously multiple models of the brain aren't new. They go back to Plato and before. But in the naming of them before, there was always an implicit value judgment. That there was one part of the brain which was considered responsible, worthy, and the other part was there effectively to be suppressed by the first part. And actually I think one of the things that arises from this is actually, if you can actually create mechanisms or environments where people can make good System 1 decisions very, very easily, then you can actually benefit humanity and make decisions easier without actually people having to make some cognitive effort which would be, frankly, better spent somewhere else. And the other thing is, of course, there tended to be a sort of Stakhanovite approach to our use of rationality, which is that you must think more, be more, take more effort, think harder. And so certain models, political science models, which predate this understanding of the brain, basically required everybody to spend their entire lives making rational decisions about everything. And first of all, it's simply just not a good use of intelligence. So making things sort of instinctive. I mean, the marketing example I always give, which I have actually no evidence for, but the great advantage of working in advertising, not in academia, is you can make outrageous assertions, and it's considered something of an accomplishment, to be honest. But actually, how did you get people? In the old days of supermarkets, you had a basket and a trolley, and the trolley was enormous. It could feed a family of 10, and the basket was actually inadequate. But a lot of people thought, well, I'll just take a basket. And without anyone actually being aware of what was going on, they introduced what's called the Japanese trolley, which is the one in the middle. It's a small, shallow trolley, you see. And there's a very, very strong System 1 instinct, which is when presented with 3 options, I go with the one in the middle. And so simply understanding some of the heuristics people use, I mean, you might think of one that's more benign, although you only got a 2-2 in ethics, didn't you?
Yeah,
no. There's a very funny story, which is that, without really, Nick got a first in all his philosophy papers except ethics, in which he got a 2-2. At which point the careers advisors obviously recommended the advertising industry as the little example, I'll give you a little example of my own invention, which has not yet been instigated. If you want people to finish their antibiotics right through to the end, okay, we have an example which is the software loading bar, which is if there's some mark of progress, we'll persevere a lot longer. If you click on a link and nothing happens, you give up. If there is some little sign that something's downloading, you'll persevere. Now, if you, instead of giving people 24 white antibiotic pills, you gave them 18 white ones and 6 blue ones and said, when you've taken the white ones, then take the blue ones, the likelihood that they'll take all 26 rather than giving up early strikes me, because of this little milestone, as being increased, without actually them having to be cognitively aware of the reasons for their new behavior. I mean, we will get into ethical debate here, because, of course, it happens, System 1 often operates without us being consciously aware of... Usually, in fact. But I mean, my view is I'm a libertarian, but I don't get really, really angry when people paint white lines in the middle of the road. You know, I'm temperamentally a bit libertarian, but I don't go, you know, this is the government interfering with my right to swerve all over the place, if you see what I mean. And actually, very, very simple unconscious guidance strikes me as, you know, useful. I mean, this is Buckminster Fuller's point. Don't stop trying to bully people around using rational arguments, and instead design a better environment, in which case they can actually just do it automatically.
Yeah, I think it's better put than I could do it. Certainly, there's nothing that denigrates System 1 in the book.
No.
That was not my intention. I mean, the most highly skilled mental activities are System 1. I mean, when we become skilled at something, we do it automatically. So that's, this already, you know, places the two systems in a... And System 1 is in most ways better at what it does than System 2 is at what it does, because System 2 is limited in terms of short-term memory and ability to do things, and it's slow, and it's effortful, and it's costly, and it's lazy. And System 1 is truly wonderful in terms of the amount of information that it can bring to bear. And I also... understanding, and that might be important to advertising, I think it's important to communication in general, understanding that a lot of the time you're not really talking to System 2, you're talking to System 1. And it is a rule, really, of thinking that I think, you know, many people have confirmed, that if you sometimes believe conclusions, and if you believe in the conclusions, then you find the arguments convincing, and you believe that the conclusions follow from the arguments. But actually, it's the conclusion that you believe, and you don't believe them because of the arguments. It's, I think, the rare case where people believe in something because they believe in the arguments for it.
Yes.
And recognizing this, and that this is a fact of human nature, and that whether, you know, it's the Royal Society or the National Academy communicating science to the public, they have to know this, that they are talking to System 1 if they want to be heard, because that's the way people are.
The euro was the perfect slow motion example of that, wasn't it? Sorry, I've probably... But actually people wanted a unified currency and then effectively constructed arguments that... I mean, the interesting, I think it's your brilliant point that the System 2 brain thinks it's the Oval Office, whereas in reality it's the press office.
Yes, I mean, yeah.
Which I think is the most perfect...
I speak of System 2 as, on many occasions, the spokesperson for System 1. So your beliefs come from something else. I mean, you know, if you ask yourself about the main beliefs you have, and where do they come from? Well, many of them come from your childhood. You know, basically you believe in what people you like and respect believe, and why you like and respect them is not an argument, it's something else. But for most of us, most beliefs come from there. And the arguments are something else. But we build arguments, we pretend that we got to our conclusions from arguments, when in many cases it isn't true. So recognizing that it isn't true, and that in fact System 1 runs the show to a very large extent, and that's the one that you want to convince, that's the one that you want to move. And that creates ethical problems, and it creates responsibility and so on, but you know, if human nature is like that, we'd better know it.
Yeah, and I think in the conclusions, you say very clearly, you say, I often cringe when the work I do with Amos is used to just say that human beings are irrational. I just say that we don't match up to this rational model. And I thought that definitely puts you at odds with some of the, at least popularizing accounts of this work, I think.
Well, I mean,
and correctly at odds, I would say. I think the people who try to paint us as irrational are unkind and unhelpful.
You know, I mean, obviously, Dan Ariely has written, you know, he writes book with the irrationality in the title. Now, he's an excellent psychologist and he knows his stuff and so on. And substantively, there is very little disagreement between us. But he likes the word irrational, and I really don't. I don't think that this characterizes people appropriately. I think that because the association to irrational is something that is, you know, impulsive, emotional, crazy,
yes,
unresponsive to reason. No. And that's not what people are. I mean, basically, most of what people do is just fine. And describing them as irrational, I think, just doesn't do them justice. Now, they're not rational by the economist definition of what rationality is. But that definition is so extreme that it's a very minor indictment that people are not rational.
Well, because obviously that's a problem for us as advertising people, because we don't want the headline that says advertising people understand your irrationality. It's already bad enough. We didn't need that on top of this suspicion we had it. But what word should we or description prefer instead?
You speak to system one, which is, some people would say is not better, because you speak, if you accept that people have very little control over the system one, then you are accessing and moving things in people that they cannot resist because they don't know it's happening. So, the ethical problems are really quite serious. It's not that they're made easier by eliminating the word irrationality. If you're speaking to system one, there is a problem, because this is not the way that people like to think of themselves. They like to think of themselves as reasoning agents. And even if it is the false image that they have of themselves, they really insist on that being the case. So there is a strong reaction to people who openly will declare, we are talking to parts of you that you're not aware exist.
I think there's an interesting question, because many people in their working life, and obviously it's extreme if you're an accountant or something, your status is derived from displaying your system 2 abilities. And no one ever gets fired, to use that old IBM slogan, for being too rational. But there are cases, if you're designing, for example, a bonus scheme, or you're designing something which actually involves either individual human behavior or even more complex mass human behavior, where actually the best solution is an irrational one. Now, both Nick and I, Nick for longer, and probably more successfully, have been on this diet where you don't eat any carbohydrates, okay? Now, it's the Nassim Taleb, your friend. I got it from him, although he doesn't seem to practice.
No, he practices
no, but
other things.
But interestingly, what's very interesting about that is, now, if you're if you're a dietary advisor or a nutritionist, the logical thing is you say, this is your calorific intake for the day, and you should stick to that. Okay? Now, that's a very difficult thing to do, because it requires you constantly to invoke system 2 to eat meals that are smaller than the meal you want to eat. And it's tiring and cognitively difficult, and it requires a huge amount of self-policing. If you just say, I don't eat carbohydrates, which is recommended by some people, once a week you go to a shop and you don't buy any carbohydrates. You need exercise no further self-constraint for the following week, because there aren't any carbohydrates in the house. So that is not a rational recommendation, and you might get fired as a government food scientist for recommending it, but behaviorally, it's enormously easier to follow. And both Nick and I, with more success on his part, have done this very, very easily and pretty painlessly. Now, it's just an interesting question that when government, the person designing the policy has to look rational in order to justify his policy to everybody else. And yet the actual, so I suppose what I'm saying in Jonathan Haidt, are you a fan of University of Virginia psychologist, makes the point that all political science actually predates our understanding of how the brain works. So most political systems are actually designed in a belief of potentially infinite rationality, for example. I think that is quite interesting, that actually where do we actually allow system 2 and call it in, and when do we just run on autopilot?
Okay, I was going to say, as Roy's outed me, he's outed me getting 2-2 in ethics, just say that, but 68 pounds down a year to this day, so. And
congratulations.
Thanks to your book, actually. So my soon-to-be written book, Behavioural Economics, made me thin. You will, you'll be getting a name check.
Actually, do sell your next book as a self-help book, because they sell tons. The really funny story about this is when Das Kapital was published in the United States, the publisher marketed it as a self-help book on how to accumulate capital. And it was a bestseller. Obviously, nobody read it, but then nobody reads self-help books anyway. They just buy them. So very clever. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So I suppose one of going from the point of view of communications, one of the phrases you coin in the book is what you see is what you see what all there is. So we react just to what we can see. And one of the things we tend to believe in marketing and branding is that people are consuming communications as part of constructing an argument where they're balancing brands against each other. And this clearly demonstrates people They just see what there is in front of them and they make their conclusion very rapidly without any attempt, or very rarely any attempt to add extra information. And you go further and say it's not just that we don't think about what we can't know, we really can't think about it. And I thought it'd be worth expanding some more on that.
Well, I mean, to try to put it as accurately as I can, it's when you need information that you don't have, you usually are not aware that you need any. That is, if you have partial information about something, you will make the best story possible out of the information you have. Yes. And you may not, and you will be, your confidence will be determined by the coherence of that story. Now, when you're comparing brands to each other, it's not that we are instantly moved by anything that we see at the moment. You may have, preferences that are brought in, by association, by memory. So it's not only what you see at the moment that rules. It is what you see at the moment may make you think of other things, and in particular, it make you think of the other brand. So if the associative system is set up that way, so it's not. It is not that system one is invariably ruled exclusively by what is in front of us. There is an enormous amount of influence. The influence of context is very powerful, but it is not all powerful. It's easy to exaggerate it, I think.
Rory?
Yes, I mean, there is an interesting question, and that system one in particular, if unpoliced, will take a very narrow area of comparison from which to make a decision.
That's right.
And I was intrigued. I went to the RAC club to meet someone a few months ago, and I asked him, being vulgar and Welsh and having no sense of decorum, I said, how much does it cost to join this club? And he said, I think it's £1,500 a year. And I said, God, that's incredibly expensive. Which is a club, of course it is. But on the other hand, as an alternative to buying a flat in London, it's about half the price of the council tax. And you can stay there for £80 a night. It's got a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, 3 restaurants, 2 bars, a garden, and a staff of 20 and its own post office.
Oh, this is the club, not your flat.
This is it. Sorry, my flat.
Just to make it clear,
my flat doesn't have the post office. But it suddenly occurred to me that actually, if you were to, nobody ever looks at do I buy a flat or do I join a club, because that's just a little too wide to actually set the comparative net.
That's very good.
And actually, one useful sort of heuristic to train yourself in is when I've got to go and buy something, should I try and find something from a completely different category that solves the same problem? My wife doesn't like this because she sent me out actually to buy one of those fat toasters, and I came back with a bread slicing machine instead on the argument that actually we didn't need a fatter toaster, we needed thinner bread. But actually, as an interesting exercise, it's amazing how bad we are at this. I mean, I think it's very interesting. We've got Giles Andrews from Zopa in the audience, which is a peer-to-peer lending website in the UK. We've worked a bit with Streetcar, which is the business where you rent cars by the hour. And it's very, very difficult to get people to move outside, I'm buying a car, what car should I buy, to a slightly lateral solution to the same problem. And presumably we have a comfortable number of things which we're happy comparing, and then once we've assembled that comparison set, we stop.
I mean, that is fascinating. It's true. It's that how the decision set is constructed, what are the options that we're going to consider. This is really taken for granted in most cases. And what you're pointing out is that is where big changes could be made quite often. That is moving back and reformulating the problem rather than trying to make the best decision among existing alternatives. So that here, even system 2 is doing it wrong.
Yes.
I mean, what you're pointing out is that analyzing the options that come to mind is maybe the wrong thing. It's analyzing the problem. It's going deeper rather than looking at the options you're already considering.
And you're a big George Polyer fan, aren't you, of How to Solve It, the book by...
of course.
Which is
again.
Good book recommendation. Written in what, 1950 or something? But mathematician. The inventor's dilemma and actually solve a bigger problem of which your problem is part. All those sort of techniques are interesting.
Yeah.
Because that's, we talked about, I don't suppose if people here looked like they might be old enough. In the 70s, when I was growing up, a policeman came round to our school and showed us a film which warned us not to climb inside abandoned fridges. because the door would close behind us and we would die. And I don't really like it, because Mark, you ran the COI. Does this film exist? Was one of yours?
It's part of the COI legend.
Okay.
Well, all about.
Fantastic. It's not part of some of my youthful psychodrama. So this thing exists. Now, so you've had to invent this film to warn children not to, and I shouldn't make light of it because a number of children did die very horribly in this way. But at the same time, you did carry, got scrapyard dealers to take the doors off old fridges. And there were an increasingly small number of 1950s-style fridges actually locked as of magnetic seals. And now that you don't have them, there is no problem. You don't have to tell children. And it seems to me you could never stop children climbing into abandoned fridges. That's just something children like to do. But you could make it so that fridges were safer. And this kind of thinking around things is something we should maybe look at more aggressively. I was wondering if you sort of you go through life, are there certain areas of life you think are just repeatedly, appallingly badly designed? And from a sort of professional standpoint, you think, why don't they do it like that? Have you got any sort of pet hates like that?
You know, the psychology that's being discussed here is actually, I think, the best psychology there is. That is that in many cases, instead of persuasion, you want to ask, how could we change the situation to make it easier for people to do what we want them to do? So I know you're a fan of nudge,
Yes.
and so am I. And that is really the fundamental idea, which it's actually possibly the best idea in social psychology, that when you want to change behavior, try to change the environment rather than trying to persuade people. Try to make it easy for them. And as you're pointing out, we don't do enough of that. So instead of that film, making the doors so that they can't be locked, then there is a problem that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So changing the environment to make decisions better. A lot of the nudge techniques that are intended to help citizens make better decisions in their interest, they're essentially that. They just make it easier for you to evaluate the information, and they make it easier for you to make the right decision if you don't want to bother.
Yes.
And all these are environmental changes. You change the structure. Dick Thaler calls that the architecture of decisions, and that's the idea.
I think I'm interested because I know you're involved in a thing that the greater good as a consultancy there.
Yeah.
So I wonder how that you want to talk maybe a little about your work with them, or.
Well, I sort of started a third career. I mean, I view my academic career as the first, and the 4 painful years of writing the book as a second, and I really need a third now. And after, so I'm involved in consulting. The greatest good is a misnomer, as it turned out. Two people, one of them is Steve Levitt, the author of Free Economics, and the other is Andy Rosenfield. They had the idea of founding a firm that would help very, very wealthy people in what they called, maybe should have called, evidence-based philanthropy. That is, when you're making the decision of how you want to improve the world, try to make the decision optimal. It turns out that the demand for that service is very, very small. So, as a business model, it isn't working. But so we actually deal with large firms and try to help them solve problems.
Because I suppose one thing I was interested to ask about that is that it's, in my experience of working with this, and maybe with Rory as well, it's quite it's hard, as you say, it's quite hard to reform our own thinking, and it's quite hard in organisations, I find, even to reform thinking as well. And there's a lovely example in the book you give of which you might want to talk, the story of planning a book at a university, a classic example of planning bias. Or you should tell the story. It's your story, sir.
Well, okay. It's a true story. And it's an embarrassing story at multiple levels. But a long time ago, when I was living in Israel, we had the idea of teaching rational judgment and decision-making to kids in high schools without mathematics. That was the ambition. And so I put together a team, and we were going to do this and improve the world. And that team included quite a number of very good people, some experienced teachers, and the dean of the School of Education, who is the hero of this particular story. And we worked for a year, and we're really doing very well. And at the end of the year, and I really can't reconstruct why I did that, but we would meet every Friday, and I had the thought of doing a forecasting exercise with the group, and the exercise was, can we estimate how long it will take us to complete the book and to hand a draft to the Ministry of Education, which had commissioned the effort. And I did it right, which everybody filled a slip of paper. That's the way to do it, by the way. You don't want to discuss the number first. You want to have everybody think about the problem, write down their numbers, and then you can have a discussion. So that part I did right. And everybody filled their estimates, including me and Seymour, who was the Dean of the School of Education. And all our estimates were between 1.5 years and 2.5 years. We were really convinced that this was going to be it. And then it occurred to me that Seymour was an expert on curriculum development, and he knew really all about this. And I asked whether he knew of teams that had tried to do essentially what we were trying to do, that is develop a curriculum where none existed before. And he said he did. I'm still surprised, but he said he could think of quite a few. And then I asked him, well, could you, if you know so much about them, can you visualize them at roughly the stage of progress that we're at? And he said, yeah, he thought he could. And then, I asked the obvious question, well, how long did it take them to complete the book? And he thought for a long time. I've told that story many times, so in my story he blushed, but I'm not sure at all that he blushed, but he was clearly embarrassed because he said, it occurs to me for the first time that not all of the teams I'm thinking of actually completed the book. And, that thought hadn't occurred to us. And I asked him, what percentage would you say? And he said, roughly 40%. And those who finished, how long did it take them? And he said that he couldn't think of any that took less than 7 years. And he couldn't think of any that had persisted for more than 10, so somewhere between 7 and 10, or failure and giving up in the middle. And then I asked him the final question, which is, well, when you compare us to these teams, in terms of our resources and our ability to carry out our plan, where do we stand? And he said, well, we're below average, but not by much. So that was, now, this tells you something about the way the mind works, because it tells you that all the information was in his head, all the statistical information, but he wasn't using any of it. He was building a story, as all of us were, because his estimate was within the range of 1.5 to 2.5 years. So he was building a story, like all of us were, on the basis of our own experience. He was extrapolating and then making adjustments and doing things that appeared reasonable to him. The statistics appeared simply irrelevant.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't occur to him. So that was one lesson. Many years later, I discovered that actually the real idiot in that story was myself, because what we should have done, and I wonder how many of you have already thought of what we should have done. This should have been our last meeting. We should have quit. I mean, we'd just been told that this wasn't going to work. And we didn't quit. The book actually was completed. I was no longer living in Israel. It took 8 years. It was done. It was never used. It was a total waste of time. But the fact that we didn't quit, is another psychological fact that I think is interesting. It really doesn't speak well. Especially the thing is, if you wrote a humorous piece about this, you couldn't do better, because we were writing a book about rational decision making. That was what we were supposed to be doing, and we made that egregious mistake. And I didn't understand the mistake for many years thereafter. The hero of my story was Seymour, and how he had not used the statistics at hand, but the fact that I hadn't stopped the project. That was a really stupid thing. That took me years to realize. And interestingly enough, you can examine yourselves. When I told you the story, it wasn't obvious to you. You must have quit. No, we didn't. So.
Do you think sunk cost bias and narrative bias are kind of related, in that no one likes a story that finishes halfway through or that has a reversal?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the sunk cost bias is that, you have to admit failure.
Yeah.
And admitting failure is costly. And if you can postpone admitting failure and a vague chance of saving the situation, then you are very biased in favor of doing it. So that is really well understood.
That was my first enlightening moment where I thought this stuff is... What I love about this is it's so scalable. You can use it to inform government policy, but you can use it to inform very small decisions in your life. And my little eye-opening moment when I realized this stuff is really useful is I'd bought 2 tickets to Paris for my wife and me. I think they're about £150 or something return. And I paid for them. They were non-refundable. And 2 days before we were due to go, I got ill with a really bad cold. But having paid for the tickets, I was absolutely determined to go through with this trip, spending another £500 basically in order to feel absolutely crap in art galleries, restaurants and hotels. And I happened the night before to read one of these articles about sunk cost bias, and actually the question is, the fact that you've already paid for the tickets is irrelevant. That's actually impossible to recapture. The question is, do you want to go to Paris tomorrow? And I threw the tickets in the bin and had a great weekend drinking Lemsip and watching television. And that was actually, that was the first absolutely useful, because before reading that book, it would have been inconceivable to me not to soldier on and go through with that weekend, having bought the tickets.
This story is very much the beginning of behavioral economics, and it's the beginning in Richard Thaler's mind, because he had that story of, and it turns out later, he presented it as a hypothetical story, that you have tickets for a basketball game, and then there are 2 scenarios. In one of them, you've been given the basketball tickets by a friend, and in the others, you've paid for them. And now there is a blizzard. You could reach the game, but it's the blizzard is serious, so it's not. And it turns out that people who have paid for the tickets are much more likely to brave the blizzard than, which is silly, because the only question, as you said, do I want to go now?
Yes.
And so that sunk cost fallacy is really a very, very big problem. It's a very big problem for governments. I mean, being willing to abandon a project, having lost and admitting that money has been lost. And so you lose some more rather than admitting the loss.
As a challenge to that, though, and it moves on to the final part of your books about happiness, which has become quite a big part of your work. But so in Rory's example, actually, I'd say, I was talking to my girlfriend, she had a very bad cold. She had tickets to see one of her favourite artists. And I made the argument, which I felt was substantiated in your book as well. So you should go, because in a year's time, you won't remember the cold, but you will remember the concert. And by and large, that's my experience. So I go to, so I say, no, I'll go. And it's true that, so I have holidays where objectively it rained every day and we argued. I argue a lot about that kind of thing. I remember, lovely mountains. 2 years later, all you remember is lovely mountains and seeing a flock of pelicans. Right, so the memory is quite selective in that way, and sometimes I feel you can game that selectivity to push through. So,
well, I mean, the real question is what's more important, the crappy weekend or the memory. Yeah. I mean, it's not, and quite often, and that's what we've learned from this work, the two don't agree, so that optimizing your experience in real time and optimizing the memory that you'll keep of it lead you in different directions.
So the experiencing self and the remembering self are
quite often in conflict.
And the experiencing self is, the remembering self, there's a wonderful example of, I think, colonoscopy, isn't it? Yes. Where the remembering self is disproportionately affected by how...
So don't go there, he's going to go there.
Oh, sorry.
No, we should, it's a good example.
This is where your narrative of the past experience is not actually a product of the duration or extremity of the pain of the experience itself, but how it ended, is this right?
Yeah.
Because we have an interesting debate. Quite a few service brands here, including, for example, British Airways, I think Intercontinental Hotels. And one of the interesting questions is, one of the things is that because of confirmation bias, I saw a whole analysis of customer feedback from a stay in a hotel in Memphis, I think it was, where effectively every single figure they scored was effectively predominantly influenced by what the check-in experience was. If they had a bad initial experience, their brain decided, I'm going to construct a narrative here of a bad experience. They just went around looking for corroborative evidence that it's a crap hotel. And if they had a good check-in experience, they basically decided to be in a good mood and looked for supporting evidence to, So this wasn't just, what do you think of the service, which would be reasonably correlated with what your check-in experience was like. They thought the ice sculpture in the garden was crap if they'd had to wait 20 minutes at check-in. And so if you're an airline or a hotel chain, then are there particular sort of moments you need to...
I mean, obviously, the first is crucial,
Yeah.
and the end is going to be quite important as well.
Interesting.
To the extent that the end is separate from the beginning. I mean, if you can, but those two are important moments. In many other experiences, it's the most extreme moment that counts. So this is the one that you're going to be remembering, from that evening with the artist. You may not remember, your sniffles or your discomfort. You may remember the most extreme
Is that a
moment.
von Restorff spike, is that right?
That I don't know.
There's a
I
memory-
mean, I know von Restorff, but I didn't know the spike thing.
The chap who's the Telegraph's chess correspondent, Charles Keane, I think it's Raymond Keane, is it? He's also a memory competitor, and they have the three things: primacy, recency, and this von Restorff spike, which is that in any list, if one thing stands out as being exceptional, it's much easier to remember.
Yes.
I think. So there's an interesting question for service organizations. Do you actually create what we might call a sort of random moment of truth, which is just particularly noticeable and that will actually dwarf everything else? Quite an interesting debate.
Well, I mean, in terms of predicting what you will remember, I mean, there is now a fair amount of knowledge about what you will remember. By the way, I think that result, the main result that we had in the colonoscopy study and in other studies, was that the duration of the experience doesn't very much matter. What matters is the peak and the end, and those count. Now, I think a study was done on the efficacy of advertising. And 15 seconds or 30 seconds came out about the same. So that the duration didn't matter if you provided the same peak and the same end. So that's...
So the use of duration is actually just, you need enough space to create the narrative within it, but
to-
actually the
to get
duration
to the
itself.
peak. The
to get to
duration
peak.
itself.
The duration itself, and that's very interesting. That's plausible. I will believe that.
Or that'd be next time you hear that argument, we need a 60 love to let it breathe. The scientific evidence will be in that's just not true. So I look forward to throwing that one back.
Okay.
But I was going to talk a little more about the happiness work, because that seems to have become so very important to you in your sort of latter career. I mean, are you sort of, do you have any, can we make ourselves happier, or can we create a happier society?
Well, can we make a happier society? I would say quite possibly yes, to a minor degree. I mean, by reducing suffering. I mean, I am a believer, unlike my friend Lord Layard, who believes in improving happiness. I'm more inclined to reducing suffering. It fits my more pessimistic temperament, but it's also, I think, more socially acceptable as an objective for society to reduce suffering. And I think it's feasible because you identify the sufferers and you try to make them better off. So that's real. Then there are other things that you can do. If loneliness is a problem, then you can have policies that will help people with the issue of loneliness. If long commutes are terrible and keep people from spending time with the people they love, which is the essential condition for happiness, then that suggests policies about commute. So there are things that society can do, I think, that are genuinely worthwhile and worth doing. And that justify measurement, to identify the sufferers, to identify the costs of various things. About individuals, I'm more skeptical, the amount of control, in part because moment-to-moment happiness is so really essentially determined by genetics, so that, identical twins reared apart and brought together 40 years later are strikingly similar in their level of mood. So that we know. You can decide to spend your time better. That's one of the things. You can't really control your mood, but you can, that's very much what you were saying earlier. You can decide on your circumstances. You can make one decision, like the length of your commute, that will change your life. It's not multiple decisions, and it will affect the quality of your life.
This is a very important distinction, isn't it, between those annoyances or pleasures which effectively normalize after time, and those things where the pain never goes away. So one of the mistakes is made is that people move further away from their place of work because they fantasize about the advantages of a third bedroom or a fourth bedroom or a larger garden. Yeah. But after 6 months or so, the pleasure of the third the third bedroom starts to dissipate, and your general level of happiness returns to its norm. Yet the pain of the longer commute is with you and unavoidable every single day. And there's certain things, like commuting and things like noise, I think it never...
You never adapt to. You never adapt to pain, you never adapt to noise, you never adapt to psychological depression. So there are things you don't adapt to, there are other things you do. And there is... The most interesting thing, I think, that we found in the research on happiness is what I've called the focusing illusion, which is that anything that you think about, you will exaggerate its importance. I mean, I have a sort of fortune cookie about that, which is that nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you're thinking about it. So just thinking about anything makes it look bigger. And now, the focusing illusion is a major problem because it can causes you, and that is an ethical problem for advertisement. You can create a need which now looks very important to people and will cause them to do things that they shouldn't do.
Body odor and athlete's foot were both invented conditions, I think. Yeah.
And then it turns out that there is more focusing illusion for something than for others, and that's related to your point. So you can think that having a bigger car, a bigger house will change your life, but in fact it won't. But if you change the amount of time per day that you spend with friends, you will not get used to that. So there is more of a focusing illusion for something than for others. And we can make better decisions if we're aware of that. So that's...
Do you buy, I mean, Layard goes further possibly than you do. The business that actually the benefits of wealth to your happiness, in most cases, tail off above a certain level of earnings, I think.
Well,
or it depends who you are.
There are very clear results in that. Internationally, there is a claim which I think turns out to be completely false, which is that that there is no effect across countries beyond a certain level of income. That's wrong. That comes from plotting the data against income rather than against log income. It's a mistake. But on individuals, there is a very clean story and actually very straightforward. And it's different. The impact of household income is different depending on what you measure. So if you measure mood, you get one set of results, and if you measure life satisfaction, what people think about their life, you get another. So for mood, it's absolutely clear in the United States.
And that's the experiencing self mood.
That's the experiencing self.
Yeah.
Being poor is very, very bad. And everything is worse when you're poor. Divorce is worse, illness is worse. Every misfortune in life is to some extent mitigated by money. But beyond a certain income, which in the US, even in expensive places, is about $70,000 per household, which isn't a lot of money. Beyond a certain income, absolutely nothing happens. It is flat for mood. Mood no longer improves. Life satisfaction goes on improving. So people are more pleased with their life the more money they have. But in terms of emotional well-being, it's very bad to be low, but it really doesn't help beyond a certain point. And I I'm quite sure of this result because I did it in collaboration with my colleague Angus Deaton, who is a famous economist, and Scotsman. I'm not sure he would want to be described as an Englishman, a Scotsman, and there is nothing that happens beyond $75,000. So that's very crisp result at the individual level. At the level of countries, by and large, the correlation is, very strong, and contrary to what some people have claimed, improving standard of living does tend to raise the life satisfaction in countries.
So I just wanted to, there's something you said just in that way, one of the things advertising can do is focus on a need that you don't necessarily have, and that you're using up, as it were, some of your mental bandwidth. And I think there is this idea, and regulators in this country are coming around to it, that if your ability to make decisions is finite and hard to grow, maybe impossible to grow, and people use it up casually, badly. So, for example, the energy market in this country, by having incredibly complex tariffs and far too many of them, no one can work out what the best deal is. Those sort of companies, they not only market a product badly, but they commit a sort of a sin against the citizen by squandering their mental resources. I just wonder if you wanted that sort of hypothesis that we should take that responsibility to look after people's...
Well, in the United States, major effort in regulation in the Obama administration is trying to protect the consumer from being faced with deliberately complicated decisions, because this is really done not for people's benefit. But in general, attempting to facilitate decisions, to present decisions in the easiest way possible. I happen to be looking in my consulting world at how choices between telephone programs are offered in the UK, and it looks very bad. It's just needlessly complicated. If you look at the way that Apple company designs its choice system, then it's four dichotomies. There are four things that you have to decide on, and you decide on them in sequence, and it's easy and transparent, and you're done. And if you presented all the options, it would be much more complicated. And so, there are good ways and bad ways of presenting people with choices, and it ought to be the responsibility of organizations to try to facilitate that.
And there is a contribution, isn't there? That your feeling that you have made the right choice.
That's right.
Will be affected by the nature of the choice you made, and therefore your general well-being and satisfaction with a product may be hugely affected.
Yeah, it's not just enough to make the right choice. You want to make a choice you can believe in is an important part of experiencing a reasonably sort of happy or sort of contented life. That seems an important thing. So we're currently heading towards the point where we take some questions. I just want to have one last question for you as we round that out, which is we're interested in, obviously we're a creative industry, and we're interested in how you have ideas. But throughout the book, you actually talk quite a lot about how you've done your work. And I just wanted to give you a chance to ask you to talk a little bit about that, because one, to talk about the man you dedicate the book to, Amos Tversky, who you seem to have a very good working relationship with. But maybe also a man you have a more combative relationship with, just as productive, Gary Klein, and you talk about that in the book. But I thought it might be interesting for people to hear about those kind of working relationships.
You're not going, not all academics are alike, so my story is really social. That is, for me, work was a social experience, and I always had collaborators, and I very rarely did anything by myself. And when I did, I didn't enjoy it. With Amos Tversky, this was quite special. I mean, we were an unusually good pair, and in that we really enjoyed each other's company enormously. And so there was no boundary between work and play. So we would talk about anything and think in the meantime. And everything was funny, including work. And an interesting effect of that is that you tend to do very good work when you work that way, because it gives you infinite patience. You're never bored. So you can go on and on and on and argue about words, a single word, for many hours, because it's pleasant. So that was one experience, and it was It was an unusual one. And both of us, I think, recognized that we jointly were better than each of us alone. And we also knew, I'm revealing something here, that we couldn't work with a third person, because as soon as we were with a third person, a competitive element would creep in that was never there when just the two of us were in the room. With Gary Klein, it was a different story. I mean, this is something that I've been interested in recent years. I hate anger, I really dislike controversy, and so I've looked at something that I call adversarial collaborations, that when people disagree, they try to work together, not necessarily to reach agreement, but to clarify the differences. So I am a skeptic about intuition. I find flaws, and Gary Klein is well known as the guru of people who has written a beautiful book, Sources of Power, on professional and expert intuition. And so he was on one side and I was on another, and I invited him to work together. And we did, in trying to figure out when intuition is good and when it's bad.
Yeah.
We explicitly we defined that as when you are right and when I'm right. I mean, we're both right, so let's just find the boundary. And it took us, a number of years. And it wasn't easy, and we nearly broke up, and, we had a lot of quarrels and so on. But in the end, we ended up really good friends and with a good product, I think. We actually figured it out. When can you trust intuition and when can't you? And so that was a very different kind of experience, but also a good one.
That was when you particularly when you have a large amount of feedback, you've been doing something a lot, and you need to make a decision quickly. I mean, I guess tennis players play through.
It's when you need a lot of repetition, so everybody has heard about the 10,000 hours, but, whatever, you need a lot of repetition. But mainly, you need for the world to be regular.
Yeah.
So I don't believe in expertise in the stock market, because there's just too much noise in that system. So, people can watch it forever, and that's not, by watching stocks going up and down, you're not going to develop expertise. There is no expertise in long-term political forecasting. No. There is just too much randomness, and so it can't be done. So there are domains in which you cannot develop expertise. But when you get immediate feedback, and a lot of it, and for a long time, and the feedback is precise, then expertise will develop, and then ideas will come to your mind, and they'll be the right ones. And the prime example is chess. So a chess master, the first ideas that come to a chess master, all the moves are strong ones. Then they will analyze, but no weak moves come to their mind. So that develops, 10,000 hours and immediate. In chess, it's a perfect example. Tennis is another one, where you get immediate feedback on the success of what you're doing. So, yes, you can develop expertise that way.
There's an interesting example, I think, which is the pilot who landed on the Hudson, the Sullenberger, where he only had about 4 seconds to decide whether he could make it to Teterboro Airport or make an emergency landing or not, and decided it was impossible and went for the river. But the interesting thing was he was an amateur glider pilot in his spare time. And so there's a heuristic, I think, which is you don't need to know altitude, rate of descent, velocity, and the distance to the airport. You simply put the plane in a low as possible rate of descent. Then you look out of the window, and everywhere on the ground, am I right here? Everywhere on the ground that's moving down, you can land, and everywhere that's moving up is a place you can't.
I haven't read that story, but
sorry,
it's actually, he was a glider, and you
yeah.
could see it, because the film of that was very beautiful. At the very end, he put the nose up, which is something that glider pilots do. So it was his glider experience, and he was an expert.
Yeah.
He was just doing what came naturally to him after making that first decision.
Nose up at the end. I just thought those. My real fear as someone who has a doctor on their passport on a plane is that someone will come to me and say, "Someone has a heart attack. Can you help them?" And I rush to the front. Unfortunately, they say, "I'm dying. Before I go, can you explain Russell's paradox?" so on that, at this point, as they say, we have to lose listeners on the world service, so we can open it out to questions for reasons, permissions, and copyright.
Can I ask one very quick question, which I've
Go
been
for it.
dying to ask, which is, this is prospect theory in two very simple questions. I'm sorry. Which do you prefer? It's a 50% chance of winning $500,000, or I use dollars, not euros, because I wanted the currency to have some actual value, or 51% chance of winning 470,000. Now, interestingly, no one there is taking a 30,000 loss for an extra 1% chance. But if you ask the question on the right, 99% chance of winning $500,000 or a 100% chance of winning 470, to a classical economist, you should answer the same way to both. Is this right?
Yeah.
But nobody does. You'll pay a very, very high and disproportionate premium for certainty. Now, I just wonder, I've got to ask this question, does this apply with the brand premium? In other words, a recognizable famous brand enjoys a similar, if you take this example, this is a Chinese make of television. It's, ricks in 4% chance of being crap, realistically, at $299, and you've got a Philips, otherwise identical in size and apparent picture quality. I've said 0.1% chance of being crap, maybe slightly higher than that, but they're clients of ours, and they're limits to my intellectual honesty, to be honest. And now, are consumers making a similar decision when they pay a premium for a brand, which is their disproportionate? Now, in a completely logical world, you say, well, there's only a 4% chance of it being crap, so I'll take a 4% or 5% discount. Do you see what I mean? Does anyone understand this? If there's, logically.
Yeah.
Now, shall we ask the one man who definitely
exactly,
does?
I've got to ask, because it fascinates me whether this is possible or not.
Well, I mean, the examples sound, there is a clear difference between certainty and probability, and so people will clearly pay a premium for certainty in I think, almost any shape it takes. So if the brand makes you feel safe, in that sense, in any sense at all, and the other brand has uncertainty in it. Now, people don't like uncertainty, and they dislike it even more if they don't know how uncertain they should be. I mean, so so yes, there is the equivalent. You would expect the equivalent of a premium. To the extent there is in addition, of course, there is a big advantage to familiarity.
Yes.
That is, anything that you've seen a lot and
Or heard of.
Is going to feel safer, because this is evolution. If you've seen something a lot and it hasn't eaten you yet, then probably it's okay. And so this is a very general trait, that anything that you see a lot of, you tend to like better up to a point.
Ray Kroc, the extremely unpleasant but interesting founder of McDonald's, or co-founder of McDonald's, had a phrase which is, people don't want the best burger in the world, they want a burger that tastes just like the one they had last time. Which is the kind of evolutionary instinct that if I've eaten it before and I'm still alive, then it's okay to eat.
Probably okay,
Yeah.